Okay, so I think that means we are ready to go. Um, Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I am Amanda Graham. I'm the academic director at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's Dartmouth Energy Collaborative Lunch Without Pizza seminar. Just as a reminder, the Dartmouth Energy Collaborative, we host this group together with the Sustainability Office and the Thayer School of Engineering and the Revers Center for Energy at the Tuck Business School at Dartmouth. And we're also delighted to have the Rockefeller Institute and the Anthropocene Working Group and the Environmental Humanities Group at Dartmouth helping to co-sponsor today's event, which is particularly important. And I've been really looking forward to this one for a long time. And so I'm really delighted to introduce to you today Nathaniel Stinnett. Nathaniel is the founder of the Environmental Voter Project, which he created in 2015. He has over a decade of experience as a senior advisor, a consultant, a trainer for political campaigns and issue advocacy nonprofits. And more importantly, he has been named a visionary by the New York Times and a voting guru by Grist magazine. And so you'll be hearing a lot more from Nathaniel in just a minute about data science and why we should pay attention to that as environmentalists and folks who care about the environmental vote. But I do just want to say that in my experience with Nathaniel, which goes back to our days together at the MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative, where he is a member of the board, he's in addition to being active in a really important space, he's a genuinely kind and thoughtful and warm human being. And I'm just thrilled that he's able to have a really outsized impact on the world and that we're able to include him today. He's really, in my view, I think Nathaniel's really only just getting started. So without further ado, Nathaniel, please take it away and teach us about the Environmental Voter Project and all that entails.
I can't wait to do it, and thank you so much for that extraordinarily kind introduction, Amanda. It's so nice to see your face. I'm so grateful that you invited me to be a part of this extraordinary work series, and thank you as well, Stephanie, for helping to handle logistics to get this up and running. And thank you for all of the organizations that are helping to co-sponsor this. I really, really look forward to it. Bear with me for 1 second while you see my eyes going back and forth here. I'm going to try to share my slides and make sure everybody is seeing things the way they ought to see them. Usually I can do this. Here we go. Does that look right? Am I sent? Great. Okay. So I can't wait to go into detail about the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project and more broadly about how data science and behavioral science have an oversized impact, not just in modern politics, but in particular in environmental politics. But first, I just want to outline how the next 55 minutes are going to go. I'm going to present for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we're going to have what I am sure will be a really fun, robust Q&A session. What that means is, by design, I'm going to breeze over some things. Believe me, I could talk about this stuff forever, but I want to make sure that we drill down in detail on the stuff that you care about, not the stuff that I think might be interesting. So if there's something that I give short shrift to, make a note of it, ask a question about it in the Q&A, and just, again, please bear with me and understand, because I want to respect all of your time. I want to present the stuff that I think might be interesting to you, and then we can dive into it. So I hope that sounds good. I'm going to use the nonprofit that I started as an example to describe these topics that I'm going to be presenting about today: data science, behavioral science, and why both are so important to environmental power right now. And so first, just to understand what the Environmental Voter Project is, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that does just one thing. We find non-voting environmentalists and we get them to vote. That's it. We don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment. We are not in the mind-changing or opinion-changing space. We are solely in the behavior change space. And I think it'll be really important to understand that sort of dichotomy between changing minds and changing behavior as we have this discussion today. And there's one really big reason why at the Environmental Voter Project we focus on this, and I think it's extraordinarily important for the environmental movement writ large to understand this problem that we are trying to solve, because it's important for all of us to understand, and that's this. One of the biggest reasons we can't consistently enact progressive environmental policy at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, is that voters do not prioritize environmental issues. They just don't. Let's go back in time for a bit. This is going all the way back to 4 years ago, leading into the 2016 presidential election. Likely voters heading into the 2016 presidential election, as you can see in this polling data, only 2% listed climate and the environment as their top priority, and another 2% listed it as their second highest priority. My guess is that many of you, like I, were pretty frustrated that climate change wasn't mentioned once in the 3 presidential debates in 2016? Well, this is why. This is why. When there's no demand for something in a particular marketplace, who on earth is going to supply it? Voters did not deeply care about these issues, so there's no way that politicians are going to talk about it. There's no way that broadcast networks are going to talk about it. Now, the good news is, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, things have gotten better since 2016, at least when it comes to number of people caring about these issues. In the 2018 midterms, 7% of actual voters listed climate or the environment as their #1 priority. Now, to be clear, this is an apples to oranges comparison. People who vote in presidential elections are a larger and different population than people who vote in midterm elections. But still, that 2% to 7% rise from 2016 to 2018 is a pretty big deal. And although coronavirus has messed some things up, we know that at the turn of the year, so December 2019, January 2020, polling data of likely voters in the 2020 presidential had 12% of likely voters listing climate and the environment as their #1 priority. So think about that. 2% of likely voters in the 2016 presidential, up to 12% in the 2020 presidential. A big, big boost. We can assume that that's come down a little bit because of coronavirus, but some polling has shown that it probably hasn't gone down that much. But what I'd like to suggest to all of you is that we can't be patting ourselves on the back. Because even if it is up near 10, 11, 12% of voters listing climate and the environment as their #1 priority, that is not nearly enough to drive policymaking. And I want to be really clear now, because my guess is if you are part of this discussion, you probably live and breathe a lot of things about climate and environmental policy and climate and environmental politics. And sometimes polling data can be pretty confusing. There is an enormous difference between people's preferences and people's priorities. Yes, enormous majorities of Americans prefer government action addressing climate change. But just because they prefer it, just because they'd rather have that rather than not have it, doesn't mean it's a top priority of theirs. And that is where the environmental movement is falling down. There aren't nearly enough voters who list climate and the environment as their #1 priority, because that's what drives policymaking. Who cares how many voters prefer government action on climate change if it's like their 20th priority? Politicians surely don't. And so this is an enormous issue. And I would suggest to you it's a particularly important issue because of one thing in particular. And if there is just one thing that you take away from this afternoon's discussion, let it be this. So pay attention. Who you vote for is secret. But whether you vote or not, whether you show up and cast a ballot for any particular election, that is public record. That is public record. Whether you vote or not is public record. And that, my friends, is the building block of pretty much all policymaking and campaigning at the local, state, and federal level. And here's why. Campaigns only target likely voters. Now again, remember what I just said. Whether you vote or not is public record. So let's say that Amanda is running for governor of Massachusetts, and I am running her campaign for governor. The first thing we're going to do with our limited time and limited money is look at public voter files, see who is likely to vote in this gubernatorial election and who isn't. And who do you think we're going to spend our time and money talking to? It ain't the people who time and time again have not voted. No, we're going to talk to the people who have a history of voting in this one election that we care about. And surprise, surprise, that's what campaigns do. Campaigns spend most, not all, but most of their time and energy and money talking to people who are likely to vote, and they literally know by name and street address who these people are because it is public record. And I know that might sound awful and cynical, but it's something we readily accept in every other aspect of our lives. I mean, we don't expect Ford Motor Company to care about 3-year-olds who don't drive cars, right? No, Ford Motor Company markets their products to people who can use their products. Well, politicians do the same thing. Politicians care about voters, not non-voters. Which leads me to the second point. If campaigns only target likely voters, who do you think they're going to poll? Whose opinions do you think are going to matter to them? Yeah, surprise, surprise, campaigns only bother to poll people who have a history of showing up in the elections that those politicians want to win. Put simply, politicians don't care about the opinions of non-voters. They don't care about the priorities of non-voters. And again, whether you vote or not is public record. It is public record. And so that polling data that I just showed you on the previous 2 slides, it's bad news for the environmental movement because there's nothing secret about that. This is data that any politician knows anywhere at the local, state, and federal level. When you poll people who are likely to show up in the election you care about, there aren't nearly enough of them who list climate and the environment as one of their top priorities, not nearly enough to actually move policymaking. Now, that's the bad news. I promise you, this is not going to be all gloom and doom. I promise you this is going to be an optimistic and even a good news presentation. And here is why. It turns out that the reason this is happening is not why you might think it is. It turns out the reason so few voters care about climate and the environment is not because too few Americans do. So let me say that again because it's important. The reason so few voters care about climate and the environment is not because too few Americans do. Actually, there are tens of millions of Americans who are registered to vote and list climate and the environment as their #1 priority. So what's going on here? Why aren't they showing up in polls of likely voters? Well, it's because environmentalists are awful at voting. It turns out that the environmental movement does not have a persuasion problem. We've actually done a pretty good job of persuading tens of millions of people to not just care about climate and the environment, but to list it as one of their top priorities, if not their single #1 priority. No, we don't have a persuasion problem. We have a turnout problem. We have a behavioral problem. We ain't showing up to vote. And as I'll say for maybe the 5th time, whether you vote or not is public record. And so, of course, politicians who want to win elections aren't going to pay attention to the policy priorities of non-voters. Instead, they're going to pay attention to the policy priorities of voters. So before I get into how we at the Environmental Voter Project are solving this problem, which also gives you a glimpse into how modern political campaigns and in particular environmental politics are dealing with this problem, I just want to put some numbers on it so you understand exactly what I mean by this environmental voter turnout problem. 10.1 million environmentalists did not vote in the 2016 presidential election. Now, what do I mean by that? These people care so deeply about climate or the environment that it is their #1 priority over all other issues, their #1 priority. And they were all already registered to vote. They just didn't bother walking out the door on election day. 10.1 million in an election that was decided by 77,000 votes in 3 states. That is a big, big number. What does that look like percentage-wise? What does that look like when we compare it to overall average turnout? Well, let's look at a few different elections. In the 2014 midterm election, 44% of registered voters voted. Only 21% of environmentalists did. And again, when I say environmentalists, I'm using a pretty idiosyncratic definition. And this is people who care so deeply about these issues that it's their #1 priority, because these are people who really drive policymaking. That's a huge turnout gap there, between 44 and 21%. Now, if we fast forward 2 years to the 2016 presidential, 69% of registered voters voted versus 50% of environmentalists who are registered to vote. 2018 midterm election. So this is the one that happened about a year and 9 months ago. 57% of registered voters voted, so much more than we saw in the 2014 midterms. 2018 was actually the highest turnout rate of any midterm election, going all the way back to 1914. And believe me, that was a big year for politics. People were voting like 3 months after the war to end all wars broke out. So that's how big a deal 2018's turnout was. 57% of registered voters voted. 53% of environmentalists did. A lot better. But again, I want to be clear about this problem we're talking about here. The environmental movement, even with all of the momentum we've seen of the last 3.5 years, marches in the streets, talking about it in the media like we've never talked about it before, the Green New Deal, all of this stuff, we're still not even up to the national average of voting rates. And believe me, when you look at other issue constituency groups, when you look at groups of people who care about different issues, they're not struggling to meet the national average. They're blowing through it. If you care about gun rights right now in the United States of America, if you're an NRA member, you vote like it's your job. You're not worried about hitting the national average. You're turning out at 75, 80, 85% for some of these national elections. Whereas we at the environmental movement haven't even caught up to the national average yet. We need to start punching above our weight. We need to start doing a much better job than this, because we're leaving all of that latent political power on the table. And another important point that I want to make here is this. I know this is frustrating. I know you're saying, oh my gosh, you're telling me that like all these environmentalists don't vote. What I would suggest to you is this is an enormous opportunity, because we live at a moment in time where it's almost impossible to change people's opinions and change people's minds, especially around climate change. It's extraordinarily difficult, and it's very expensive to change people's minds and their opinions. But if you're able to find people who are already with us, if you're able to identify people who care so deeply about our issues that it's their #1 priority, and then just tweak their behavior and nudge them into becoming better voters, well, I won't claim that's easy. It's not. But it's a hell of a lot easier and a hell of a lot cheaper. So the fact that there are all of these dyed-in-the-wool, already persuaded super environmentalists out there who just aren't voting, well, that's a solvable problem. That's an eminently solvable problem. And I would suggest to you, as frustrating as it is when people in our community, in our movement are not voting, this is a huge opportunity. This is a huge opportunity. This is like playing a basketball game and then in the 4th quarter you realize, oh, like all of our best players are sitting there on the bench. Like we have this army of environmental voters that just hasn't shown up yet. And that's a great opportunity. All right, we've got about 15 minutes left before we get into Q&A. So I want to get into the 2 ways that we at the Environmental Voter Project solve this problem. And it will also give you a glimpse into how modern political campaigns, including the Trump and Biden campaigns right now, are individually identifying particular types of voters and then helping get them to vote. Because this is not only important for the environmental movement as we try to solve this turnout problem, but it's also just important for all of us if we want to be educated and informed members of modern society. We need to understand how these campaigns work. So at EVP, we essentially do three things. We identify. So we use data analytics and predictive modeling to individually identify these non-voting environmentalists. And don't worry, I'm going to go into some detail on what that means. Step two, we then mobilize them. We as a nonprofit have over 3,600 volunteers around the country now, who once we as an organization identify these non-voting environmentalists, then our volunteers message to them to try to get them to vote. And here's the really interesting thing. Because we're so confident about the first step, because we're so confident that we're accurately identifying people who care so deeply about these issues that it's their number one priority, that opens up an entire universe of behavioral science techniques that we can use to get these people to vote. Because if I already know that Amanda cares deeply about climate change and all I need to do is get her to vote, well, hell, I could talk about chocolate chip cookies if that's the best way to get her to vote. I don't need to talk about climate change at that point. I can be completely agnostic with my messaging because I don't need to waste any time or energy on issue education. I can cut right to the easier and cheaper stuff and just get her out the door. And then the third thing we do is habit reinforcement. And what I mean by that is, at least at our nonprofit, we don't focus on one-off elections. Instead, we focus on changing the electorate. We focus on using every election, no matter how small, federal, state, local, general, primary, special. We're involved in library trustee races. Any election is an opportunity for a behavioral intervention. Every election is an opportunity for us to talk to non-voters and start building their habits to turn them into better voters. Because I guarantee you, you can't change people's voting habits if you only talk to them every 2 or 4 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. You would never do that if you were trying to get someone to change their eating habits or to start exercising more often. And surprise, surprise, the same thing goes for voting. So very quickly, how do we do it? And again, please bear with me. I'm not going to go into an enormous amount of detail because if you're interested in some of the data science and behavioral science, I'd love to delve into it during the Q&A. We start first by building what's called predictive models. And I want to be very clear here. I'm using the Environmental Voter Project as an example, but these are the same tools that presidential campaigns are using right now. And what they do is they survey tens of thousands of people, huge polls. And they survey people off these public voter files, but they also have access to a lot of other public data, consumer data and behavioral data. And it doesn't need to be like shady stuff like you heard about Cambridge Analytica where they were stealing stuff. No, there is a lot of publicly available data out there. And what these campaigns do is they will poll people, 10,000 people in a state, let's take New Hampshire, and let's say 1,500 of them respond to the pollster saying, oh yeah, I list climate or the environment as my number one priority. Well then, it's the easiest thing in the world for data scientists to sift through those 1,500 people and see what data points they have in common. And let's use this as an example. They can say, oh wow, looking at our data, forestry employees were 11 times more likely than the average person in New Hampshire to list climate as their number one priority. Ooh, and people who had ditched their landline and only have a cell phone are 9 times as likely. Ooh, and Catholics are 5 times as likely. And basketball fans are more likely than baseball, hockey, and football fans. And no single data point is predictive on its own. But what these data scientists can do then is they can start looking for groups of data points that point towards a particular profile of someone who cares deeply about climate and the environment. They can say, wow, if you are a Latina grandmother who lives within 5 miles of Hanover, New Hampshire, ditched her landline, bought a Volvo between 6 and 8 years ago, and has 2 kids in the public schools, whoa, we're seeing you've got like a 92% likelihood of fitting our criteria. And they can look for these hidden patterns and correlations. And then, and here's the really interesting part, then what campaigns do and what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we are able to build profiles like this for every single person on a voter file in a state and assign a score to them from 0 to 100. Here's a score distribution for, I think, the state of Georgia. And as you'll see, the average person only has like a 13 or 14% likelihood of listing climate as their #1 priority in Georgia. But then there are millions of people who are 4 or 5 times the state average. And they have very, very high likelihoods of listing climate or the environment as their top priority. And again, I want to be clear. We assign a score to each individual in the state voter file. And this is frighteningly accurate. Frighteningly accurate. I know this sounds like a very convoluted and complicated process, but a good way to think about it is it's actually similar to the life insurance industry. I don't know how many of you have applied for life insurance, but what you do is you give them lots of data about yourself. Here's how much I smoke. Here's how much I drink. Here are my eating habits and my exercise habits. And yes, I like to dive out of airplanes. And they build a risk profile for you by comparing you to all these other people. And they build a predictive model. They don't call it that. They call it an actuarial table, and it's slightly different. But it essentially allows them to predict, not to get morbid, but like to predict how long you're going to live. And if they're off even by a little bit, the global economy crashes. Like they've gotten really good at this. Well, this is what we do at the Environmental Voter Project, but we're not trying to predict how long every voter in New Hampshire is going to live. We're trying to predict how likely they are to list climate and the environment as their top priority. And it is frighteningly accurate. And this is the same type of tools that the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign are doing to identify the issues that you care about. They have assigned scores to every single one of you in individual records in their voter files. And is that a little creepy? Yeah, but it's how campaigns are run now. We shouldn't think of campaigns as targeting demographic groups. Big data like killed the soccer mom. No one targets soccer moms now. They literally target people by name and street address, and they have a pretty good idea of what issues they care about. So what this allows us to do at the Environmental Voter Project is find these super environmentalists and then just weed out the ones who are good voters, and we only target the ones who are unlikely to vote. And as you can see, we know them by name and street address because we have this public data on voter files. These are the over 2,600 people in Hanover, New Hampshire, who list climate, who have a very high likelihood of listing climate and the environment as their top priority. They're already registered to vote, yet they didn't show up in the 2016 presidential election. These are the over 42,000 in Philadelphia. These are the over 42,000 in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, quickly, what do we do to turn these non-voters into voters? Well, as an organization, we canvass and call and text and mail and send digital ads. But what I think is far more interesting for these purposes and for this discussion is the messaging that we use. What we have found through dozens, maybe even over 100 randomized control trials now, and what behavioral psychologists and behavioral economists have found over the last decade of research, is that if all you're trying to do is change someone's behavior, so you're not trying to change their mind or their opinion, just their behavior, which is what we're trying to do. The best way to do that is to not try to rationally convince them of the importance of the action. I know that sounds crazy, but what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we never talk about the environment. We never try to rationally convince someone of the importance of voting, because study after study, and I can get into this in more detail in the Q&A if you're interested, study after study has shown that it doesn't work. It doesn't increase turnout. It doesn't get people to take the desired behavior, which in this case is voting. Instead, what we do is we aren't treating voters as rational beings. We treat them as social beings. or more precisely, societal beings. We treat human beings, as most behavioral scientists are beginning to understand and treat them, as animals who set up these large societal norms and societal structures that in many ways govern our behavior on a daily basis far more than our brains do, at least the rational sides of our brains. We need to get away from the idea that human beings are going around their daily life making cost-benefit analyses and deciding like which action will have the greatest return on investment. And again, I can go into some experimental results if you're interested in the Q&A. Instead, what we have found and what other behavioral psychologists have found is that if you view the act of voting as an expression of who you are or who you want to be, it is a far more powerful prompt to action. And here's what I mean by that. We essentially find a societal norm and then leverage that to get someone to vote. So here are some examples. Peer pressure, basic peer pressure. We will text you, so we'll text Stephanie and we'll say, hey, Stephanie, did you know last time there was an election, 83 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? Now, is that like totally juvenile stuff that you would hear on like the 4th grade playground? Yeah, it's just basic peer pressure, but peer pressure works. Peer pressure totally works. Take it from someone who lives in Massachusetts. In 2016, we knew every single thing that was going to happen on our ballot. We knew who was going to win the Electoral College. We knew who was going to win every congressional election. We knew every state rep and state senator and all of the 4 statewide ballot questions. Yet 4 million people turned out to vote in 2016. Why? Not because they thought their vote was going to make a difference. They knew it wasn't. No, we turned out to vote because of who we are, who we wanted to be. It was important to be a voter. It was important to be a part of something. Another example of this type of messaging that we use and other behavioral scientists use, we find another societal norm that most people buy into, which is most people want to be thought of as honest, trustworthy beings. And so maybe some of you have even experienced this. One of the most common techniques for political campaigns now are called voter pledges. You try to get someone to promise to vote. And it's kind of deceptively simple, because what that allows you to do is right before the election, you can go back to them and you can say, hey, Amanda, I just want to remind you on June 30th, you promised that you were going to vote. And now the election's coming up on Tuesday, and we know it's important to you to be an honest promise keeper who follows through on her promises. Now we've switched the conversation. Instead of me trying to rationally convince Amanda of the value of her one vote in an election where millions of people are going to show up, we've created this normative framework where the act of voting helps decide whether Amanda's a trustworthy person who keeps her promises, which is far, far more powerful. Okay, I want to finish up the presentation so we can get to Q&A. So let me speed through this. This is how powerful these techniques are. In randomized controlled trials, we were able to increase turnout 2.7 percentage points over our control group in the 2018 midterms. That was good enough for adding 59,000 brand new voters to the electorate, a big, big number. We graduated 93,000 out of our program. That means these were people who weren't voting, and at the end of 2018, they had voted in a federal, state, and local election. They had become super voters. In 2019, we expanded from our original 6 states that you see here into 6 additional states. And this is what I mean by habit reinforcement. We use every election. We used 613 local elections in 2019 to change people's voting habits. At the end of that year, we had graduated 253,000 people out of our program, including almost 51,000 in Pennsylvania, a state that was decided by 44,000 votes in 2016. We don't have any graduate numbers from our brand new expansion states. And finally, I want to bring up this idea that every election matters. The best way to make a new voter in November is actually to try to build their habits now, get them to vote in summer state primaries, talk to them in the fall in Massachusetts here where we are, and actually in New Hampshire as well. We have state primaries in September. This is a great opportunity to turn non-voters into voters. And then I'll leave you with this. This is far more of a sort of academic discussion, but I do want to give you some action items in case you want to get involved. First of all, if you go to our website, environmentalvoter.org, and sign this pledge to vote, we will send you election reminders whenever you have an election, local, state, or federal. 2, you can volunteer with our nonprofit at environmentalvoter.org, but I would suggest to you, volunteer for something, people. Volunteer for something. This is a crucially important moment in time, and I'll come back to that in 1 second. And then finally, be loud and proud. As I mentioned in my brief discussion of the behavioral science behind this stuff, we all look to get cues from the people around us and the people in our peer groups, and that more than anything drives our behavior. And so if you care about environmental issues, don't just be a voter. Be loud and proud about it. Make sure everybody understands that that is part of how you respect the environment. And I'll close just with 2 quick things. First, please, 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 under no circumstances, leave this presentation today and say, oh gosh, this Nathaniel Stinnett guy said environmentalists aren't voting, this is awful. No, this is an enormous opportunity, people, an enormous opportunity. If I told you, oh, we looked at all these polls and it turns out no one cares about climate change, that would be bad news. That should make you wring your hands. But that's not what we're seeing. Tens of millions of people care deeply about climate and the environment. We don't have a persuasion problem, we have a turnout problem, we have a behavioral problem, and that is solvable. We can absolutely solve that. That is an easy problem to fix, or an easier problem to fix. And the second and final thing I'll say is, we have 125 days until Election Day. 125 days. Early voting in some states starts in 80 days. You will never get this time back. Get in the game. Imagine yourself 125 days from now sitting down on your couch to watch election returns roll in. You do not want to have any regrets. And I'm not suggesting to you that you should get involved with the Environmental Voter Project, although that would be awesome. I think you'd really, really enjoy it. But get involved with something. It is enormously important that we in the environmental movement take voting supremely seriously, because remember what I said. Politicians know who votes and who doesn't vote. And surprise, surprise, they only care about the opinions of voters, not non-voters. I'm sorry for going 4 minutes over, but I'm really excited to have a good Q&A. So thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Nathaniel, thank you so much for that, that run through. And we have questions already starting to come through. So folks, if you haven't asked a question yet in the Q&A section, you have one, please feel free to do that. You can also upvote other questions that you see to bring them to the top of the list. So let's jump right in. The first question, many young people are environmentalists, yet they have the lowest turnout. How can we reach them to turn them out to vote? They tend not to read newspaper editorials or other traditional sources. I'm at a loss, this speaker's at a loss for how to reach out to them.
So that's a great question. And first of all, I just want to reiterate the accuracy of the premise. Like, yes, young people have lower turnout rates, and yes, young people care deeply about climate and environmental issues. So that's absolutely right. What's interesting is, again, it's not the editorials, even though you're right, they don't read newspapers. We need to get out of this mindset that the way to get someone to vote is to figure out an issue they care about and then logically persuade them based on that issue to vote. I know it's something we want to believe, but it just doesn't work. Study after study after study has shown that it doesn't work. Instead, we need to use these tools that I mentioned before. We need to treat them as societal beings. We need to use peer pressure and social pressure. And it doesn't, I know that often has an ugly connotation, but it doesn't have to have an ugly connotation. It can simply be things like sending people text messages. This is what we do with young people. We'll send them text messages and we'll say, did you know we've already gotten 42,102 people in Hanover, New Hampshire to promise to vote in the upcoming election? Or do you know that young people are promising to vote in this election like never before? Is that peer pressure? Yeah. Is it like totally juvenile crap? Yes, but it works. It works. And to give you an example of this, because I know it rubs against what we want to believe. Next time you're in your physician's office, which hopefully won't be for a while, but next time you're in your physician's office, look at the wall. They all have advertisements about trying to get people to vaccinate their children, which is a significant behavioral challenge in the public health field now. And whereas they used to try to convince you to vaccinate your children because like it helps them not die, it turns out that wasn't working. And so now they're adopting these normative frameworks where they say things like, all smart parents vaccinate their children. Because don't you want to be a smart parent? And this is the stuff that works. And then second, and finally, I'll just mention the channels, the communication channels with young people obviously matter an enormous amount. So one, text messages. You need to use text messages when communicating. I would suggest with all people, but in particular young people. Also, digital ads. Young people live online. And that doesn't just mean display ads or Facebook. It also means pre-roll video, so that video that pops up before you watch something, whether it's on YouTube or elsewhere. It also means Snapchat and TikTok and things like that. But you need to go where they are. You need to go where they are. And then the final thing I'll say is, especially with young people living at home with their parents, sometimes you can leverage that. Sometimes you can send mail to people's parents, encouraging them to like get their kids to register or get their kids to vote. It's an underutilized thing, but there's a lot of data showing that it really drives turnout.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions here asking the why question, right? So why do environmentalists in the US fail to vote? Why have behavioral scientists identified some root causes? Are there parallels between non-voting environmentalists and other special interest groups that don't vote? You know, are environmentalists not voting because they don't have faith in the current two-party system? What can you say to questions about why don't environmentalists in particular vote?
I know, like, come on, why aren't these people voting? So these are all great questions. And, you know, this is a Dartmouth affiliated presentation, so I'm gonna feel free to get nuanced and nitty gritty with you guys. But let me just start by saying, we don't have a good answer. There's no hard and fast answer, but there are some things we know. So let me dive into this. As any social scientist, not just behavioral scientists, but any social scientist will tell you, it's pretty easy to set up an experiment that tells you how to get someone to take an action. That's something social scientists are really good at. Psychologists, economists, sociologists, political scientists. What's really hard to do is the opposite. What's really hard to do is to figure out why someone is not taking an action. Really, the only thing you can do is ask them. And when you ask people why they aren't taking an action that society views as important, like voting, guess what happens? They lie their pants off. They lie their pants off. There are a whole bunch of response biases that make all of the data that comes in really, really untrustworthy. And I won't get into a billion examples, but just the one that one of the questioners mentioned, which was, do we think part of the problem is that people who care about the environment maybe don't trust the two-party system or don't think that politicians aren't being responsive? Well, we have a whole lot of data that says, yes, that is often the excuse that people give, but no, we do not think that's the cause of them not voting. Because get this, people who vote all the time also don't trust the two-party system. People who vote in every election also think that politicians aren't responsive. We know what the excuses people give for not voting is, but we really don't have any good data on what the causes are. I'll close just by saying this though. There is one thing that we do know, and that is there are some pretty strong demographic correlations to groups that don't vote. So part of what we're seeing here is merely a demographic issue rather than an issue-specific issue. And here's what I mean by that. When we look at environmentalists, pretty much however you want to define them, but particularly the way that we define them at the Environmental Voter Project, which is people who list these issues as their #1 priority. They are much more likely to be people of color, so African American, Latinx, or Asian American. They are much more likely to make less than $50,000 a year than more, and they are much more likely to be young than old. And what do those 3 demographic groups have in common? They all vote less often than the average American. So part of what we're seeing here has nothing to do with the environment, it's just that demographic correlation. But here's what will really screw with your mind. That's not everything that's going on. Because when we look at those isolated groups, when we look at those subgroups and drill down, when we look at young people, the ones who care about the environment vote less often than other young people. When we look at African Americans, the one who care about the environment vote less often than other African Americans. So something else is going on here. And I could talk for hours about some ideas we have, but the more academically responsible thing to say is we don't know. This is a black box. It's a black box why these people aren't voting. What we do know is how to get them to vote. And ultimately, that's what's important, right? And it's using these behavioral science tools that we mentioned before. We find societal norms they buy into, and we leverage that to get them to vote.
So let's try to dig in a little bit on some of that data. I've got a question here. Can you give some examples of the experimental results you mentioned that show the relative effectiveness of different get out the vote persuasion strategies? What were the experiments and what's the size of the effect?
Yeah, so great question. So a very elegant experiment that is actually very old, but it really, I think, succinctly shows this difference between using what's called rational choice theory or rationally trying to convince someone to vote versus expressive choice theory, which is treating them as a social animal and using norms to try to get them to vote. And gosh, I mean, I think it was from, if I'm remembering correctly, the 2004 presidential election, believe it or not, John Kerry versus George Bush. And it was a randomized control trial. So there was a control group that didn't get any messaging. And then there was a group A that got message A and a group B that got message B. Group A got this rational argument about why it's important to vote. And it went like this. Amanda, turnout's going to be low on Tuesday, so you've got to vote because your vote's going to make a difference. Now that's mathematically accurate, right? If turnout is low, so if the denominator is small, then Amanda's 1 vote in the numerator does have a higher likelihood of making a difference, right? So that's a mathematically accurate assertion. It turns out that not only did that message not work, it depressed turnout. It decreased turnout when compared to the control group by 2.0 percentage points. And man, if you don't think 2.0 is a lot, ask Hillary Clinton. Like, that is a big, big number in this business. But here's the really interesting thing. Let's get to the message B that population B got. It was simply the inverse of message A. It was turnout's going through the roof. Everybody's voting on Tuesday. You've got to vote. Well, now the denominator's enormous. Amanda's 1 vote in the numerator has an infinitesimally small likelihood of making a difference in this election. Yet that message increased turnout 1.4 or 1.5 percentage points over the control group. Just basic peer pressure. Basic peer pressure. Even though it's very clear that that message was saying like, now your vote doesn't make a difference. Now let me fast forward to sort of some more cutting edge versions of this. There are some messages that we use at the Environmental Voter Project where we take advantage of another societal norm, which is that even people who don't vote still want to be thought of as good voters. So we will send people in the mail copies of their personal voting histories. Because again, remember what I've now said like 6 or 7 times, who you vote for is secret, whether you vote or not is public record. We will send these people in the mail something that says, Amanda, just want to remind you, whether you vote or not is public record. Here's a copy of your previous voting history before you. The election's on Tuesday. We may follow up with you afterwards to find out how your experience at the polls was. Is it a little like Orwellian and creepy? Like totally. But it jacks turnout through the roof. In high turnout elections like midterms, we've gotten 2.6, 2.7, or 2.8 percentage points over the control group. In low turnout elections, where you can really jack turnout, sometimes these letters get you a 4.1 percentage point increase over the control group. And again, it's not because we're mad scientists. It's not because we know something that nobody else knows. This is where the behavioral scientific community is when it comes to getting people to vote or getting people to exercise or getting people to eat healthy. These are the tools that they're using.
Thank you. Another question, let's see, that's a different angle on this. For state and local elections, it seems that your approach relies on environmental voters to correctly identify the candidate who's best on environmental issues. Do you have data showing that they successfully do this?
So great question, but I would disagree with the premise. No matter who, I'm not going to claim that who you vote for is unimportant. Of course it's important. Of course it's important who wins elections. But I'll also say this: politicians go where the votes are, period. It's one of the few things in our hyper-partisan environment that still unites Democrats and Republicans. Boy, do they all like to win elections. Nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing. So the first, and I think most important thing to understand, is that even if you go to the ballot, even if you go to the polling place and you write your dog's name in on the ballot, that will drive policymaking, because every local, state, and federal official knows who the environmentalists are from these predictive models and who they aren't. And the only question is, are all these environmentalists going to show up to vote or not? That ultimately is what drives policymaking. Now, as a secondary issue, is it important for environmentalists to have good environmental leaders elected rather than people who hate the environment? Like, yes, absolutely. And to get to that, no, we don't know who these people choose. Nobody does. Anybody who tells you they do is lying, because who you vote for is still secret. What I can tell you, though, is there has been a lot of research done by League of Women Voters, and I think Pew has also done some research on this as well, showing that when people claim they are uninformed about the candidates, and that's either why they didn't vote or that they showed up but they were still uninformed, there's a lot of reason to believe that that's an excuse that doesn't hold water. It's a lot of reason to believe that people are actually doing the research and that it's very easy for them to find out who is endorsed by various environmental groups and things like that. Now, I want to be clear. Does that mean that there isn't a lot of static out there? No, of course there's static. Of course people can get confused. Of course I could choose a candidate that you might not think is the environmental champion, but it is less an issue than most people think it is. At least some of these studies have shown. And again, I just want to reiterate, no matter whom we elect, even if we elect the world's greatest environmental champion at the federal, state, or local level, she still needs to decide what to spend her political capital on. And politicians are not going to spend their political capital on something that voters don't care about. They never are. They never are. I will freely admit that I'm a big fan of Barack Obama's. But in 2010, and they'll admit this, they had to choose, what are we going to spend our political capital on? Are we going to spend it on climate change, or are we going to spend it on healthcare? And surprise, surprise, they spent all their political capital on the thing that 34% of voters listed as a top priority instead of the thing that 1% of voters listed as a top priority. So yeah, it's important to elect the right people, but no matter whom we elect, we're not going to get anything done unless we build this demand from voters, not non-voters, but voters, to get environmental leadership.
Nathaniel, thank you so much. We've got more questions coming in, but I think we need to wrap at that point to keep ourselves on time. I want to direct everybody to the Environmental Voter Project website if you want further information, if you have further questions to ask of Nathaniel or his staff or his crew of 3,600 volunteers. I thank you so much for bringing the data to us and for bringing the insights to us. And may we all take that under advisement as we navigate the next 125 days. So a big thank you to Nathaniel for being with us here today. Really appreciate it. And Stephanie, could you throw up our slide of upcoming activities and events at the Irving Institute? Thanks, Steph. So tomorrow we have the next in our series of new energy conversations with young scholars and researchers in the energy space with Parth Vaishnav from Carnegie Mellon on electrify everything and why that's a good idea. Next Tuesday, we have 2 weeks from today, we have a great panel on the possibility of energy stimulus funds and what that could mean for a transformation of our energy systems, in particular the electric grids of the future. And then 2 weeks from tomorrow, another young scholar, Rebecca Ciez from Columbia University, digging in on energy storage. So a great schedule coming up for July. So once again, Nathaniel, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and all best wishes to everyone. Stay healthy, stay well, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Thanks again, Nathaniel.
Thank you.